morning, one and all. Mary Bakija completed her MS-LIS at the Pratt School of Information without full-time employment in May 2020, entering the job market in a pandemic amidst a rapid rise in virtual interviews. By the time she started as a program manager at Metro Library Council in August 2021, Mary was invited to 12 virtual interviews and received 4 job offers, and was rejected or ghosted by several dozen other employers. For her previous role in libraries, archives, and news organizations, all interviews were by phone and in person, which she found much more nerve-wracking than the virtual experiences. So without further ado, we'd like to introduce Mary Bakija.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you to everybody who is joining us today. Also, thank you for putting together this great series. If anybody out there missed any of the previous sessions in this series, I'd recommend going back to check out the recordings that are available on our YouTube page. As mentioned, my name is Mary Bakija, and I'm a program manager here at the Metropolitan New York Library Council, which is also known as Metro. I will be discussing some tips on virtual job interviews that I've acquired from both experiencing them myself and from a lot of research that I did to learn more about the best practices of virtual interviews and for advice from those who are on the hiring end of the process. So to give you some context, I started in this position at Metro in August of 2021, so nearly a year ago now. Back before libraries, I worked in journalism. I was a writer and an editor, and all of my job interviews, as Anthony mentioned, were held in person. They were also in person throughout library school for internships and part-time positions at libraries and archives around the city. But then I graduated from library school, as mentioned, in May of 2020. And the pandemic rapidly changed the way many job interviews are being held, including all the ones that I was going on. I started to apply for full-time library positions in January of 2020. And through August of 2021, I applied for more than 60 jobs and was invited to 12 virtual interviews. So the information that I'll be sharing today is based on those experiences, as well as some of the research that I did on the topic. And I've included some of the resources that I found in my research throughout the presentation and also at the end of these slides. This is also a good spot to note that I'm a pretty anxious interview subject. I can get really nervous when I'm on the spot like that. And I often hear things like, oh, you'll get better with practice. As you do it more and more, you'll get better at it. And for me anyway, that's true to some extent, but it's not completely. So if you're the type of person who is cool and confident in interviews, I think some of what I'm sharing today might be the sort of thing that comes naturally to you, but I still think there'll be some info that I'm providing to you that will be useful for anybody out there who's a little bit less nervous during interviews than I am. So what is the likelihood that your next interview will be virtual rather than in person? The jobs website Indeed posted its annual hiring report this past fall. They surveyed more than 1,100 employers and found that 82% of them are now using virtual interviews. That was spurred on by the pandemic, of course, but they did find that it turns out that employers like using virtual interviews. They found that 93% of those employers that they spoke to plan to continue using virtual interviews in the future. For a little bit of perspective from the library world, last month, the blog Hiring Librarians looked into the current state of virtual interviews. They asked for input on Twitter, and then they shared longer responses from 3 librarians who are involved in the hiring process at their institutions. And what they found is that if the job that you're interviewing for will have you nearly exclusively working at, say, a public services or assistance desk, where you interact with patrons for the majority of the time in your workday, hiring managers are more likely to want to interview you in person, obviously. But they also feel it's important to do in-person interviews if you're going to need to get a feel for the place where you're working, like if you'll be relocating to a new city to take that position. But the pandemic has changed some minds about when that in-person interview becomes necessary. So many hiring managers seem to be more willing to do a first round of interviews virtually and then do a second round of interviews in person. It turns out to just be more convenient for everybody. It takes a lot less time for everyone. And as we've all become a little bit more familiar with the technology, it no longer seems like a hurdle for people. It's pretty understandable that it's becoming the preferred method for first round interviews. So basically, there is a pretty good chance that your next job interview might be virtual. Of course, a lot about virtual interviews is exactly the same as in-person interviews. You're still going to want to be over-prepared. You want to have all your research on the organization and the role, and you're still going to want to dress for success, and you're still going to want to be yourself. But some of the things that are different about virtual interviews are things that might not be intuitive. For example, we might be more familiar with the technology now, but what should you be doing about the audio, or what's in your background? So those are some of the things that I'd like to talk about today with you, so that you're as prepared as you can be ahead of any virtual interviews that you're going to have. I, for one, find that being super prepared makes me feel a lot more confident, so that I'm able to present myself and my experiences more convincingly to an employer. Now, how can you be over-prepared? This is one area that I think is exactly the same as it is for in-person interviews. The first thing is that you want to have way more information than you might ever need, so that you won't be surprised by any questions that come up. Learn as much as you can about the organization, read their website, check the LinkedIn profiles of the people who will be interviewing you, things like that. And then think about how your role will play a part in that organization. What work have they done lately that really excites you? What can you bring to that work, and why is that exciting to you? Those right there are two questions that you might even be asked, right? So how else can you learn more about the organization? If possible, see if you can talk to some people who have worked there in the past and ask them about their experiences, the culture of the place, the pros and cons of working there. Also, go back and take a really, really close look at the job description that was outlined in the job posting. How will your work experiences help you accomplish the job functions that are outlined there? Think of really specific examples. Consider how you can highlight your accomplishments. That can help you anticipate questions that they might ask you, and then you can prepare some answers to those questions. You might also find it helpful to prepare answers for what are called behavioral questions. Those are things that are like, describe a time you faced a challenging situation and how did you handle it? A lot of people recommend answering those kinds of questions using what's called the STAR method. For that, you describe a situation where you had to accomplish a task. You describe the task, you describe the action that you took to accomplish the task, and then you describe the results. So STAR. It sounds like a pretty basic formula, but it can be really helpful in showcasing your accomplishments, your approach to problem solving, how you work with a team, and how you work on your own, and on and on. I find that prepping answers using the STAR method can also help you keep your answers concise, so it'll keep you from going off topic. It's also important to make a list of questions that you'd like to ask them. Always keep in mind that they're not just interviewing you, you're interviewing them. So what do you want to know about what it's like to work there? What is your potential supervisor's management style? Can you get a sense of what the work-life balance is? Having questions you want to ask them can also help you come across as interested in them, which is, of course, an important thing to display in an interview. Even now, in just describing what you want to think about as you're doing your research, I naturally brought up some questions that are samples of what an interviewer might ask you. So you probably will too, as you're looking into what is happening at that company, you'll come up with questions that you might get asked in that interview. But if you need some ideas about questions that you might be asked or that you might want to ask them, you should check out the library interview question database. It's this really great spreadsheet that includes questions that have been submitted by library workers after they've been through the job interview. And I found it really helpful when I was prepping for interviews. So maybe you will too. It's very library specific. It's awesome. Now, personally, I find it helpful to write out my answers for potential questions. For me, and I think a lot of other people, writing helps with memory. And so it makes those answers stick a little bit better. It also helped me be better prepared for future interviews because I already had my own database of answers that were written out that I could refer to and then adapt as needed to different kinds of positions. And now here is where there's a difference between in-person and virtual interviews. When you're in person, it can be tricky to refer to your notes, right? Like having something on paper and going back and forth may not work. So in a virtual interview, though, there are ways to have notes more available to you. I, for one, would arrange my Zoom window, which I would shrink down a little bit. So I could put that on one side of the screen and then had a document of notes that were visible on the other side of the screen. So I could check my notes for key points that I had wanted to make during that interview. As long as you make sure you're doing your best to look directly at your computer's camera, who's going to know that you're looking at notes, right? So just try to keep it natural. Referring to notes is good, but you don't want to sound like you're just reading to them on the screen. Okay, so the main difference, obviously, with a virtual interview is that you're dealing with technology. It's this added factor that is what's going to take the most time. It's going to be something that you really want to spend time on so that you're less likely to encounter problems during the interview. If possible, I would advise you to ask a friend or a colleague to do a practice run with you. You want to take that chance to familiarize yourself with the platform, whether it's Zoom or it's something else. And just a note that I am going to be referring to Zoom primarily today because it does tend to be used so frequently. But the same tips apply whatever platform your interview might be taking place on. So in the practice run, you want to make sure that your settings are how you'd like them to be. What is the speaker view set to? How does your name appear? Is it displayed in a professional way? I know some people who use their Zoom to hang out with friends and play games, things like that, where they might change how their name displays on the screen so that it's more suitable for those kinds of gatherings. But this is a good chance to check those settings, make sure everything is the way you would like it, so you don't have to be dealing with that once the interview has begun. Some people recommend recording a practice interview so you can see how it will look from the interviewer's point of view. And you can then spot anything about your body language that you might want to adjust, which makes a lot of sense. But honestly, if you can handle watching yourself on video, you're a lot stronger than I am. Personally, I've never done that as a part of a virtual interview prep because just thinking about it kind of makes me cringe. So here is what you should look for during your test or if you are reviewing or recording. How does the audio sound? Experience from doing a lot of webinars here at Metro has proven that using a microphone, even if it's just your regular old earbuds like I'm using today, it usually sounds way better than using a computer's microphone. Just be careful that nothing will interfere with the microphone cord if the mic is on the cord, like a shirt collar or jewelry or your hair. You won't hear it, but they will, and it can be pretty distracting. So in your trial run, ask your friend how you sound and ask also if there are any other avoidable background noises that they might hear. For instance, the chair that I usually sit in at this desk is really comfortable to work in, but it squeaks when I shift positions. So for interviews, I like to swap it with a different chair. So I'm sitting in just a straight wooden chair right now. Then what about the video? Does the video look okay? If you can sit with a window in front of you, that's the ideal lighting. And definitely avoid having a window behind you or in the frame at all. That creates backlighting and it makes it much harder for your interviewer to see you and to perceive your body language. If you will be using natural light, try to do your test run at the same time of day as your interview will be taking place so that you can see how the lighting looks and get a feeling for whether you might need to supplement it with some other lighting. If a window isn't available, we live in a New York City apartment, and sometimes that's not the best setup for you. Try setting up a lamp nearby behind your computer, again, so that you're lit in the front, or consider a ring light. Ring lights are probably something you've heard about. They're widely available now, and they're pretty affordable. If you're going to be doing a lot of virtual interviews, if you think there are a lot of virtual interviews coming up for you, a ring light might be a worthwhile investment. I mentioned earlier about looking into your camera. It also helps to have the camera up at eye level to make that happen so that you'll be looking straight ahead at a level angle rather than having the camera pointing up or down at you. Making that happen can be as simple as setting your computer up on a sturdy stack of books, which is what mine is set up on right now. This helps create the impression of eye contact, which is something I'll speak more about in a minute. You also don't want to be sitting too close or too far from the camera. You wouldn't do that in an in-person interview, so you're trying to make it feel as comfortable and natural as possible. A good rule of thumb is to be sitting so that there's some empty space above your head and the top of the screen, and also that your shoulders and the top part of your chest is visible. Finally, will you be sharing your screen at any point during this interview? Depending on the position that you're applying for, some interviewers may ask in advance that you do a presentation. I had to do that for a couple of rounds of interviews that I was on, and I was generally given plenty of time to prepare ahead of time. So if you're going to be using slides, be sure that you share your screen during that trial run so you can get a feel for the transition between slides, that, what you're seeing on your screen, how that looks, where do you position that Zoom window? Are you sharing the full screen presentation? Ask your friend how it looks. If you're using presenters notes, are those visible? We sometimes see that here at Metro, where people are hoping to use their presenters notes, but it shows on the screen. And so that's not helpful for doing your presentation when you get that full preview. So as you can see, there are a number of things to keep in mind tech-wise. It's just not quite as simple as just showing up to the interview and winging it. So as long as you take the time to prepare, you'll be better set so that in case anything does happen during the interview that you're not prepared for, it'll be one thing that is 1 in a million and not something that you could have avoided ahead of time. Okay, another thing that is tough when you're doing an interview from your home is what happens in the background. You'll see a lot of tips for virtual interviews that will tell you to make sure that your background is neutral. Whatever is behind you in the room is just totally neutral. No clutter, but essentially no evidence that you're a person that is doing an interview from a place that is not a workplace, but is most likely your home. I think that the past few years have changed some expectations about that. It seems that people, including interviewers, have largely become understanding that we are generally talking to each other from our homes. So I, for one, am always thrilled to see people's pets and kids pop up in the background, but I know that that's not everyone's opinion. And it's also maybe not the best for an interview, especially if it will be distracting to you. With that said, some things to consider when you're setting up the space where you'll be interviewing. This seems pretty obvious, but you want to keep your background tidy. You don't need to remove all the fun knickknacks you have on your shelves necessarily, but it is probably doing you a disservice if you set your computer up in front of a pile of dirty gym clothes that are hanging off a chair behind you. I, for one, keep that over to the side. Then also make sure everyone in your home knows that you will be interviewing. If they are able to be in a different space, or if it will be helpful for you to concentrate, they can step out during your interview, that's great. But a heads up will keep anybody from popping into your background, which again might cause you to get distracted. If you're not able to find a quiet spot that you're comfortable displaying on camera, you might consider using Zoom's blurred background feature. Not one of the backgrounds that makes it look like you're on a beach or whatever, but the background that simply blurs everything out that surrounds you. One reason that I think this is okay is because, as mentioned before, you're in your home. It is not your workplace, or it isn't yet, and it seems reasonable to want to have separation of those two things. However, there are some drawbacks to using the blurred background. The first is how it can look. I think we've all probably seen someone using a blurred background at this point, and the technology is pretty good, but it's not perfect. So parts of you might end up blurred as well, right? You can think about that when it happens and the part of their head is blurred out, some of their hair, their hand disappears. If you do choose this option, one tip that I have seen is to use extra light, both on you in the front and on your actual background. What this does is that it helps the technology distinguish between you and the background, so your hands are less likely to appear blurred. The other issue is a bit of a weird one, but it's something that's worth considering. Several job websites and articles that I reviewed advised against using a blurred background because interviewers might perceive that you've got something to hide. Seems a little silly to me, but there might also be some implicit issues at work there. For instance, I saw one study that said about perceptions of others in virtual job settings that virtual backgrounds carried very low impressions with the people who were using them. And the survey respondents said things like people who were using a virtual background gave them the impression that the speaker was not authentic, was not an expert, and was not particularly innovative or trustworthy. So if you decide to use a blurred background, your best bet about that something to hide issue might just be honesty. When you're introducing yourself in the interview, you might consider mentioning why you're using it and thanking them for their patience with any glitches that the technology may encounter. So these are just some things to consider when deciding whether or not to use a virtual background. Here's one that is mostly the same as in-person interviewing, but with a little bit more room available for comfort. When you're deciding what to wear for your virtual interview, you'll want to dress how you would if the interview were being held in person, right? You want to wear what makes you feel confident while feeling comfortable enough that you can relax a bit. Of course, one difference between in-person and virtual interviews is that, as we know, Zoom captures you from the chest up. If it's the height of summer and you're more comfortable being barefoot, if the interviewers can't and won't see your bare feet, then I'm in favor of making yourself as comfortable as possible. Interviews can be really stressful. If there's a way that you can set yourself up to be more relaxed, go for it. So try to do what will make you feel confident and successful. That can mean different things for different people. Maybe you get energy from wearing a full suit and heels and dress shoes. Maybe you're like me and you're willing to bet that there will be no reason that you have to stand up during your interview. And so wearing a nice top and then cut off jean shorts might be okay. Maybe there's jewelry or a fragrance that makes you feel strong. Or maybe place a few words of encouragement from a loved one in your pocket and think about that note if you find yourself in a moment where you're not as calm and confident as you'd like to be. Okay, so here are some things to consider as you're getting closer to the time of your interview. The first is that if you think it will be helpful for you to read or reference the questions that your interviewer has just asked you after they've finished asking, it's okay to ask if they would be able to paste each question into the chat function of Zoom. I recommend emailing your interviewer about that the day before your interview, just in case they need to prepare for how to handle that on the day of the interview, but I think it's fair to ask. Some recommendations say not to have any food or drink with you on camera during your virtual interview. And I think, yes, eating on camera is not a good idea, but if you're going to be in a longer form interview where you think you might need a snack break, ask about that in advance as well. Will they be building in breaks? How many and how often? Just so that you're set up. Maybe you can station snacks nearby, but turn your camera off when you're using them. However long your virtual interview might be, though, I think you'd be set up for success if you have a good, healthy snack before the interview. Something like nuts or a piece of fruit or hummus and carrots, something like that. This will ensure that you're awake and energized and not hungry, which makes me feel cranky personally. As for no drinks, I personally think that would be unkind to the job seeker. Everything within reason. Don't sit there chugging a whole liter of water all at once, maybe, but it is certainly understandable if you need a sip or two of water after you answer a question. The next tip is that as you're sitting down to the computer just before the interview, be sure to close down any programs that you won't be needing. This will help keep you from getting distracted. It will avoid any accidental screen shares of things that the interviewer doesn't need to see, but it could also help prevent any slowdowns of your computer's operating system, which could lead to your Zoom freezing. If you have a do not disturb function on your computer, that's really useful to enable here as well, so that no notification sounds, no little bings start going off in the middle of your interview. It's also a good time to silence or enable do not disturb on any other devices that you might have around you, like your cell phone. It's a good idea to have your phone handy also, just in case if you have any connectivity issues and you need to dial in. So make sure that you also have that dial-in number for the Zoom handy, just in case you need to use your phone to connect to the interview. Finally, also, if you're using a laptop, be sure that it's charged enough and that it's plugged in. Make a checklist of all these things and have them ready. And then again, you won't be stressed out if something comes up that you weren't expecting. Now, during the interview, the next tip that I came across as I was researching about the topic was something that is new to me. So I'm only just trying it out recently. But if you notice that you tend to slouch a bit, you can try sitting toward the front edge of your chair, which helps correct that posture. Sitting up straight can help you appear more confident and engage. So this trick could be worth a try. Speaking of body language, it is okay to talk with your hands during a virtual interview. Again, everything within reason, but it can put people a lot more at ease if you're talking with your hands rather than sitting there with your arms pinned to your sides or crossed across your chest. And then if your interviewer is more at ease, there's more of a chance for you to feel more at ease too. You'll want to do your best to speak slowly and clearly. Someone once told me that over-enunciating consonants and words can help you be heard more clearly because there's less of a chance of swallowing your words. It can be work to practice, but it can be effective. Slowing down when you're speaking can help get that message across more effectively and clearly. But in a virtual interview, it can also be extra helpful for anyone who is interviewing you, who they might have a bad connection to Zoom. So they're more likely to catch everything that you're saying if you're slowing down a bit. Of course, within reason, you don't want to sound like a robot, but taking it easy can help a long way in getting your message across. This is also a good spot to note that you should keep an eye on time if possible. Speaking slowly and clearly is great, but try to keep your answers as concise as possible. Avoid running on too long. This is where having those prepared possible questions and answers can be really helpful. You want to be sure you present yourself and your experience and how it will fit into this role as completely as possible. But you also want to ensure that you have enough time toward the end of the interview to ask those questions that you have for them. And then an important piece of body language is eye contact, which I've mentioned a few times today. This is a really weird one to do virtually, right? Because actually making eye contact with the person who's interviewing you will not look like eye contact to them. Looking at the camera is what it makes eye contact happen in the virtual interview. I find that that can be a really hard thing to keep up though, because there are people on the Zoom and I want to make sure that I'm gauging their reactions and reading their body language. So one tip is to affix a little Post-it note just next to or around the camera on your computer or wherever you have the camera, just so that it can remind you to look up there as much as you can. And then as the interview comes to an end, remember to ask about what the next steps are. Ask when you're going to hear from them next. People recommend following up to say thank you to everybody that you met during the interview about a day after your interview. The bottom line is basically to be as prepared as possible. I hope I've helped a little bit in getting there. And those are my slides for today. If you're on the hunt, I wish you luck. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.